My name is Laura Bennett. I am 32 years old, and the worst 3 days of my life as a mother were the 3 days my daughter did not speak. Not because she couldn't, not because something was medically wrong. She simply stopped, closed herself up like a book someone had shut too firmly, and no amount of gentle coaxing or patient waiting seemed to find the edge where she might open again. Her name is Grace. She is 6 years old. She has fine brown hair that she likes to wear in two braids, a small nose that wrinkles when she laughs, and the kind of imagination that fills every quiet moment with something. Stories she tells herself, scenarios she sets up with her stuffed animals, elaborate worlds she builds on the living room floor with blocks and figurines, and whatever else she can recruit into the project. She has a lamb named Theodore, who has been in her family since before she could say his name properly, and for 2 years he was called Fyodor, which she insisted was correct, and which we did not correct because it was. She is, when she is herself, one of the most verbal children I have ever encountered. She narrates, she describes, she asks questions in chains, each one following the last so quickly that by the time you have answered the first, she has already moved 3 questions ahead and is beginning to suspect the fourth. She once spent 40 minutes in the car asking me about clouds, what they were made of, why they moved, whether they could feel anything, whether I thought they minded being rained on, and whether rain was something that happened to clouds or something that came from them. By the time we reached the grocery store, I had a new relationship with the weather. She started first grade on a Tuesday in September. By Friday of that week, she had stopped talking. Not completely. She would answer direct questions with single words. Yes, no, fine. She would point at what she wanted at the dinner table rather than ask for it out loud. She would nod when I said goodnight and stand in the doorway of her room for a moment before going in, the way she does when she is thinking something through and hasn't decided whether to say it yet. But the narrating had stopped. The questions had stopped. The elaborate running commentary on everything had gone quiet in a way that felt, to me, like a room where the lights have been turned off. The furniture was all still there. The walls were in the right place. But something essential was missing, and the absence of it made the whole room feel wrong. My husband Tom noticed on the second day. He is a patient man, more patient than I am, more patient than the situation usually requires, which is why we balance well. He sat across from Grace at breakfast and tried everything he had. Questions about her teacher, her classroom, whether she had a desk by the window, whether the cafeteria had pizza on Fridays, whether she had found anyone who liked the same things she liked. He asked about Theodore, whether Theodore was managing his first week at home without her, which had always been a game they played, a way of talking about separation that made the separation smaller. She answered each question in the same flat monosyllable. Fine. Yes. Maybe. She ate her cereal, put her bowl in the sink exactly where it was supposed to go, and went to get her backpack without being reminded. We looked at each other across the table after she left the kitchen. Is this normal? He said. I don't know, I said, which was the honest answer. I had been her mother for 6 years, and she had never done this before. There was no precedent. There was no folder in my mental filing cabinet labeled Grace Goes Quiet for several days after school for reference. I told myself it was adjustment. First grade is a real transition. The first year of full days, real academics, a new schedule, a classroom full of children she was still learning, a teacher she didn't know yet. Some children need time to absorb change before they can talk about it. Grace had always been someone who processed things internally before she processed them out loud. She would sit with a feeling for a while, turn it over, examine it from different angles, and then eventually bring it to me in complete sentences with context and explanation. Maybe this was that. Maybe she was sitting with something bigger than usual, and the sitting was taking longer. I held this explanation like a flashlight in a dark room. It was enough to see by. It was not enough to feel certain. On the morning of the third day, I drove her to school instead of letting her take the bus. She sat in the back seat with Theodore in her lap. She had started taking him to school in her backpack, which she had not done since preschool, and I had said nothing about it because it seemed important. I watched her in the rearview mirror. She looked out the window at the houses going by, her expression the careful blank of a child who is keeping something. "Grace," I said, "is there anything you want to tell me before we get there?" She looked at me in the mirror. "No," she said. She looked back at the window. I dropped her at the front door and watched her walk in. Small, braids, backpack with Theodore inside, and felt the particular helplessness of a parent standing on the wrong side of a door their child has just walked through. On the evening of the third day, she came home from school, put her backpack down by the door, walked to the living room, sat down on the couch, and cried. Not a tantrum cry, not the frustrated, loud cry of a child who has been denied something she wanted. The quiet, steady cry of a person who has been holding something for too long and has finally, in the safety of their own couch, in their own living room, with their own mother close by, decided to put it down. I sat beside her immediately. I put my hand on her knee. I didn't say anything. I have learned over 6 years that the first thing Grace needs when something is wrong is the presence of a person who is not going to rush her. So I sat, and I waited, and I let the crying happen at its own pace. She cried for several minutes, real crying, the kind that uses the whole face. Then it slowed, the way crying does when it has done what it needed to do. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and a face that was already returning to something more like itself. She said, "Mrs. Park doesn't hear me." I said, "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "I raise my hand," she said, "and she doesn't call on me. And then someone else says the same thing I was going to say, and everyone laughs and thinks it's that person's idea. And I've been raising my hand for 5 days, and she never looks at me. She looks at other people, but not at me." She stopped, swallowed. "I thought maybe I was doing it wrong," she said, raising my hand. So I tried doing it differently. More up and more still. And she still didn't look. I felt the pieces click into place with the sharp precision of understanding something you should have understood 3 days sooner. My daughter had not stopped talking. My daughter had discovered that talking didn't work, that her voice, raised and offered and waiting, was going unnoticed, and had responded the way some children respond to that specific and particular pain, by going quiet, by deciding, without words, that if the space wasn't going to be given to her, she would stop asking for it. She had not withdrawn out of shyness. She had withdrawn out of logic. At 6 years old, she had looked at the evidence available to her, 5 days of raised hands and unchosen moments, and drawn a conclusion from it, that perhaps she was the kind of person people didn't notice, and she had started quietly to practice living as that kind of person. I held her very carefully. "Grace," I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it, okay?" She looked at me. "You are not the kind of person people don't notice. You are the kind of person who fills up a room. I notice you. Dad notices you. Theodore notices you. And Mrs. Park is going to notice you too, because I am going to make sure of it." She looked at me for a long moment. "How?" she said. "I'm going to write her a letter," I said. She considered this. "Tonight?" "Right now," I said. She nodded, slowly, with the gravity of someone approving a plan. I sat her down with a snack, and I went to the kitchen table, and I wrote the email. I kept it careful. I kept it non-accusatory because I didn't know yet whether Mrs. Park was indifferent or simply overextended or simply human in the way all teachers are human. Imperfect, habituated, defaulting toward the louder sounds in a room without meaning to leave the quieter ones unheard. I said, Grace has had a difficult adjustment this week. She came home tonight very upset, and she described feeling like her hand doesn't get called on when she raises it. I know classrooms are busy, and it's impossible to reach every child every time, but I wanted to share this because it has affected her in a way that surprised me. I'd welcome a chance to talk whenever is convenient for you. I sent it and went back to Grace on the couch. She had stopped crying. She was eating her crackers and watching Theodore with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment. Did you send it? She asked. Just now, I said. She nodded again. Good, she said. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Even in the middle of everything, even with the image of my daughter sitting at a school desk raising her hand again and again into no response, even then she could make me laugh. Mrs. Park replied the next morning before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I was not prepared for the reply. She said, Laura, thank you for writing this. I mean that. I have been thinking about Grace this week. She is one of the most engaged students in my classroom. Her hand is up constantly. She clearly has so much to offer, and I have been failing to call on her consistently. I noticed it myself toward the end of the week, and I couldn't figure out why I kept defaulting to other students. Reading your email, I think I understand. I have been gravitating toward the children who call out rather than wait, who demand the attention rather than ask for it. Grace waits. And I have been confusing her waiting for patience rather than recognizing it as the request it is. That is on me. I am going to address it today. Please, can we talk? I read the email 3 times. She had already seen it. She had been watching Grace closely enough to notice, and she had named her own pattern, and she was not defensive about it. We talked on the phone that afternoon. Mrs. Park was a woman in her late 40s who had been teaching for 18 years. She spoke about Grace with specificity and warmth, the detail of a person who had been paying genuine attention. She was not a bad teacher. She was a teacher who had developed, over years of crowded classrooms and competing demands, a habit of gravitating toward the children who created the most noise. It was not malice. It was the accumulated groove of many years. And Grace, who raised her hand and held it perfectly still and waited, had fallen into the gap the groove created. I have had students like Grace before, Mrs. Park said, students who went quiet, and I often attributed it to shyness or personality or adjustment. I didn't always ask whether the quiet was a response to something. Your email helped me understand that difference. Sometimes quiet is something a child decides, and what they're deciding is whether it's worth it to keep trying, I said. That's exactly what she was deciding. There was a pause. I'm going to move her to the front for the next 2 weeks, she said. And I'm going to call on her deliberately, not in a way that makes her feel singled out, but consistently enough that she starts to trust that I see her. She also did something I hadn't expected. She told me that the following Monday, she was going to do an exercise with the whole class about what it feels like to raise your hand and not be called on. She was not going to single Grace out. She was going to ask every child to think about a time they had something to say and couldn't get it heard. She was going to let them draw it, or write it, or just think about it. She was going to make it a class conversation about being seen. Not because of Grace, officially, but clearly because of Grace, in the way that the best teachers make one child's experience into something the whole room can learn from. Grace came home the following Tuesday. She came through the door, and her face was different. Not dramatically different, not glowing or transformed, just returned to itself. The particular brightness of a child who has had a good day, not a spectacular one, but a good one, the kind where something that had been uncertain became certain. She dropped her backpack and said, before I could even ask, "Mrs. Park called on me 4 times today." She said it with the precision of someone who had counted everyone. "And the day before," she added, "she gave me a little nod when she saw my hand, like, 'I see you, hold on.' So I knew she was going to come back to me." I said, "And how did that feel?" She looked at the wall for a moment, the way she does when she is choosing her words carefully. "Like she saw me," she said finally. "Like I was there, and she knew it." I looked at my daughter, 6 years old, already in possession of the exact vocabulary for what it means to be witnessed, already in possession of the exact vocabulary for what it means not to be. Like she saw me? In the weeks that followed, Grace came back to herself in stages. The narrating returned before the questions. The questions returned before the elaborate living room worlds. The worlds returned before the full running commentary on everything. The weather, the neighbour's dog, the way the afternoon light came through the kitchen window and turned the dust into something gold. It came back like a room being lit, one lamp at a time, starting in the corner and working toward the ceiling. By October, she had been called on enough times that she had stopped counting, which I knew because she stopped reporting the number. By November, she and Mrs. Park had a private language. Small nods, a particular look across the room when Grace's hand went up that meant, "I see you. I'm coming back to you. Hold what you have." Grace described this arrangement to me at dinner, with the satisfaction of someone who had negotiated fair terms and was pleased with the outcome. She described it in detail, with follow-up questions about whether Mrs. Park had other private signals with other students, and if so, what they looked like, and whether signals between teachers and students counted as a language, and if they were a language, did that mean there were words in it, or just grammar? And if just grammar, could you build words from grammar, or did you need the words first? I answered all the way through dinner, and a little bit into bath time. The chain of questions was back. I have thought about those 3 days many times since, about how close I came to letting them pass as adjustment, about what I told myself to avoid seeing what was actually happening, about the distance between a child going quiet because they need time and a child going quiet because they have started to wonder whether their voice is the kind that gets heard. I think about the email I almost didn't send. I think about what would have happened if I had waited another week or 2, or decided to let the adjustment run its natural course. I think about Grace on the couch, crying the quiet, steady cry, telling me, "I tried doing it differently, more up and more still." She had been experimenting, trying to find the version of herself that would be noticed. I don't know what version she would have found if we hadn't intervened. I know it would not have been the version who asks questions in chains and narrates the dust in the afternoon light and negotiates private languages with her teachers. I want to say something to any parent watching this whose child has gone quiet in a way that doesn't fit them. Quiet that is too still, too flat, too unlike the person you know them to be on their best days. Sometimes silence is adjustment. Sometimes it is personality. Sometimes it is a child who needs a few days before they can speak. But sometimes, it is a child who has been raising their hand into nothing for long enough that they have started to learn the wrong lesson about themselves. Watch for that quiet. Ask about the first day and the second and the third. Ask, "Did anyone hear you today?" Ask it gently. Ask it every evening. Ask it until the answer changes. Because sometimes the most important thing you will ever do is make sure your child knows that their hand, raised and waiting, is always going to be seen, at least by you, at least when it matters most. If this story stayed with you, if you watched all the way to here, please hit that like button and subscribe to Tender Heart Stories. Drop your location in the comments. USA, UK, Canada, Australia, wherever you're watching from. I read every single one, every day. Tell me, have you ever felt invisible in a room, as a child or as an adult? I'd love to know I'm not alone in that. See you in the next one.